solving the worksheets also for the previous topic, right? 4.2?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, girls, we are going to start a new lesson today, which is chapter 4.3, which is photosynthesis in detail. In the last lesson, we did an overview of photosynthesis as to how the various light-dependent and the light-independent reactions take place in photosynthesis. So we are going to study all about that in detail in this topic 4.3. We are on page number 102 from your textbook, 102. Okay? So let's start with a verse from the Quran which is related to this topic. So Allah says in the Quran, and grain having husks and scented plants. So all of these are created by Allah, subhanallah, be it a plant, animal, or each and every cell, and also without the permission of Allah, even a bud, it cannot bloom into a flower. Okay, so subhanallah, we need to be grateful to Allah for all the various blessings we have. So let's move on this positive note. The objective for this topic is to describe the light-dependent reactions in which energy is captured, and to describe the light-independent reactions in which sugar is produced. Okay, so we are basically going to describe the light-dependent reactions and the light-independent reactions in detail. Okay. Can you identify the structure in this picture now that we studied already 4.2? What is this?
Miss Seema.
Yeah.
Miss, can you please add Miss Ali?
Sure. Lamis. Okay. Which one? The first one?
Yes, the first one.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. You're most welcome. That's it?
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead, sweeties. What is this?
Chloroplast. It's the chloroplast.
Yes, it is the chloroplast, wherein both the light-dependent and light-independent reactions take place, right? So where do the light-dependent reactions take place?
Across the membrane of the thylakoid.
In which part of the chloroplast?
The grana.
In the grana. And where do the light-independent reactions take place?
Stroma.
In the stroma. Excellent. Thank you so much. So let's go ahead with our lesson today. Okay. So in a way, the sugar-producing cells in leaves are like tiny factories with assembly lines. Okay, that means the leaves are normally also known as the kitchen of the plant. Why? Because it is there. It is in leaves the food is prepared, or for photosynthesis takes place. Yeah.
Samira, can join.
Okay, I'm adding her. Yeah, Samira joined. Okay, so in a factory, different workers with separate jobs have to work together to put together a finished product, right? Similarly, in photosynthesis, many different chemical reactions, enzymes and ions, they work together in a precise order to make the sugars that are the finished products. Okay, so ultimately the food which is produced in the plant leaves, it is the sugars. So in order to produce the sugars, there are various chemical reactions, enzymes and ions involved, both in the light-dependent and the light-independent reactions. Okay, so we are going to study about all this in detail in this topic. So the key concept for this topic is photosynthesis. It requires a series of chemical reactions. Okay, the first stages of photosynthesis, they capture and transfer energy. So during the light-dependent reactions, energy is captured from sunlight and moved along the thylakoid membrane. So we discussed this already in chapter 4.2. That is why the meaning light-dependent. Why? Because they need energy for these light-dependent reactions, and the energy, it is captured from the sun. From the sunlight, they get the light energy. Okay, so we'll first discuss about the first stage of photosynthesis as to how it captures and transfers the energy. Okay, So we already studied about this in your topic 2. However, the process is much more involved than that general description might suggest. So we just discussed an overview as to how this process takes place, and in this topic we are going to study that in detail. So for example, during the light-dependent reactions, energy is captured and transferred in the thylakoid membrane by two groups of molecules called photosystems. Okay, so we discussed that in grana the light dependent reactions take place and they capture the sunlight. This is what we discussed, right? So this the sunlight which is captured and transferred in the thylakoid membrane, it is done by two groups of molecules. The name given to these molecules is photosystems. Okay, the two photosystems are called photosystem 1 and photosystem 2. Now, what is the function of these molecules, photosystem 1 and 2? They help in the capture and the transfer of the energy in the thylakoid membrane. Okay. So we'll first do an overview of the light-dependent reactions. The light-dependent reactions are the photo part of photosynthesis. During the light-dependent reactions, chlorophyll and other light-absorbing molecules, they capture energy from the sunlight. So this we discussed in our last lesson itself, that energy is captured from the sunlight, and chlorophyll and other light-absorbing molecules, they capture the energy from the sunlight, right? So water molecules are broken down into hydrogen ions, electrons, and oxygen gas. The oxygen is given off as a waste product, and sugars are not made during this part of photosynthesis. So obviously during the light dependent reactions the sugars are not made, but they are made during the light independent reactions. So what happens during the light dependent reactions is only the energy is captured from the sunlight by the chlorophyll and other light absorbing molecules. Okay, and water molecules, they are also broken down into hydrogen, electrons, and oxygen is given off as the waste product, which is released into the atmosphere and which is used by the other humans and animals. So the main function of the light dependent reactions are to capture and transfer energy. Okay, so energy is transferred to electrons. The electrons are only used for energy in a few specific processes. Recall a time when you went to an amusement park. To go on rides, you needed special tickets that could be used only there, right? So if you go to an amusement park and you need to go on a ride, you need to give that ticket which can be used only for that particular ride, right? So it cannot be used for any other ride, and also once you go on the ride, you cannot use that ticket anymore. Similarly, the electrons are used for energy during photosynthesis, but not for the cell's general energy needs. Okay, so these electrons, they are used as tickets for the energy during photosynthesis process, but not for the cell's general energy needs. Okay, so energy from the electrons, it is used to make molecules that act as energy carriers. These energy carriers are ATP and another molecule called NADPH. What are the energy carriers? They are ATP and NADPH. So the ATP from the light-dependent reactions is usually not used for a cell's general energy needs. In this case, ATP molecules along with NADPH molecules, they go on to the later stage of photosynthesis. Okay, so the energy, the ATP which is produced during the light dependent reactions, not only ATP but also the NADPH, it is being used for the light independent reactions. Okay, so this energy is required for the second stage of photosynthesis, which is the light independent reactions. Okay, so let's go through the information we have on your slide here about the photosystems. The light dependent reactions, they include groups of molecules called photosystems. This process involves two groups of molecules called photosystems. The two photosystems are photosystem 1 and photosystem 2. What do? Both the photosystems, they absorb energy from the sunlight. The photosystems are named 1 and 2 because they were discovered in that order, and the numbers, they do not refer to the order of the process. In other words, photosystem 1, it does not happen first. Okay, it's only the name given to them as photosystem 1 and 2, but they can happen in any order. Photosystem 2 can happen first and then photosystem 1. Okay, it's only the name given. Now, photosystem 2, what does it do? It captures and transfers energy. Okay, as you can see in this picture here, photosystem 2 and electron transport. Now, in step 1, you can see energy is absorbed from the sunlight. How is the energy absorbed from the sunlight? With the help of which molecules?
The chlorophyll.
Yes, chlorophyll and other light absorbing molecules, they capture the energy from the sunlight. This is what happens in step 1. Now also remember, this is photosystem 2. We just now discussed that it need not be in the same order like photosystem 1 and then photosystem 2. So in this, it happens photosystem 2, it starts with photosystem 2. With the process which is going on over here now, it is photosystem 2. Okay, so you can see the chlorophyll absorbs energy from sunlight, then it energized electrons enter the electron transport chain. Okay, so you can see what's happening over here in step 2. The water molecules are broken down. They are broken down into hydrogen ions, and oxygen is released during this process. Even the electrons are released. Okay, now you can see the electrons, they are being transferred. They are entering the electron transport chain. These electrons, from where are they released? They are released when the water molecule is broken down. You can see the electrons which are released and also the hydrogen ions, and they enter the electron transport chain. Can you see over here like this? They are entering in step 2. Now what happens in step 3? Hydrogen ions are transported across the thylakoid membrane. Where is the thylakoid membrane present?
In the granite inside the chlorophyll.
Yes, it is present in the grana. So these hydrogen ions, they are transported across the thylakoid membrane. Okay, like this, across the electron transport chain itself. Okay, here. The electrons are transported in the electron transport chain, and you can also see the hydrogen ions being transported here. So water molecules, they are split. The oxygen is released as waste, and the hydrogen ions, they are transported across the thylakoid membrane. Now this is what happens in photosystem 2. It is written in detail over here. Now what happens in photosystem 1? Now photosystem 1, it happens after photosystem 2. In photosystem 1, the energy carrying molecules, you can see. In step 4, the energy is absorbed from the sunlight over here by the electrons. Okay, then in step 5, the NADPH is produced when the electrons are added to NADP. So before I show you and explain you with the help of this diagram, let me read out the entire procedure of photosystem 1. Is photosystem 2 clear, ladies?
Yes.
Is this procedure clear? Are there any doubts in photosystem 2?
No, but can you
Okay, can someone please summarize photosystem 2 for me?
The chlorophyll absorbs energy, and water molecules are broken down into hydrogen ions, oxygen, and electrons. The electrons are then transported to this green area. I think it's called the electron transport chain.
Right. Right, thank you so much, Leen. So according to your textbook on page number 103, we have the same steps again. You can check in photosystem 2.
Yes, we can.
I'm sorry?
Your voice just lagged a bit. Can you please repeat what you said?
Yeah, sure. Okay, So I'm again recapping the same 3 steps from the textbook on your page number 103, so that we don't 103 is it? Yeah, so that we don't leave out on any information. Okay. So in photosystem 2, the chlorophyll and other light absorbing molecules, they are absorbed in the thylakoid membrane. They absorb energy from the sunlight. The energy is transferred to electrons. Okay, so photosystem 2, it needs water to function. Okay. In step 1, the energy is absorbed from the sunlight, as you can see in this picture here. The chlorophyll and other light absorbing molecules in the thylakoid membrane, they absorb energy from the sunlight. Okay, then the energy is transferred to the electrons. You can see in step 2 here. Electrons and high energy electrons, they leave the chlorophyll and enter the electron transport chain, which has a series of proteins in the membrane of the thylakoid. Okay, so this is what happens in step 1. In step 2, the water molecule, it splits. Enzymes, they break down the water molecules. Oxygen, hydrogen ions and electrons are separated from each other. Then the oxygen is released as waste, and the electrons from water, they replace those electrons that left chlorophyll when energy from sunlight was absorbed. Okay, so what do you mean by the electrons from water? They replace those electrons that left chlorophyll.
Because in the beginning, in step 1, you said that when energy is absorbed by the chlorophyll, like the electrons with high energy, they move to the protein chain, the electron transport chain, sorry. So then when the chlorophyll absorbs energy again, it replaces the energy for electrons that are still in the chlorophyll.
Right, yes, thank you, Dean, that was very well explained. So I just told you in step 1, the energy is transferred to the electrons, and high energy electrons, they leave the chlorophyll, right? They leave chlorophyll and they enter the electron transport chain, right? So in step 2, the oxygen is released as waste. Then the electrons from water, they replace those electrons which left the chlorophyll and entered the electron transport chain. So those electrons, they are replaced, okay, and that left chlorophyll when energy from sunlight was absorbed. So these electrons, they are again entering the electron transport chain over here. These are the electrons which are replacing the electrons which were left in the step 1. Now in step 3, the hydrogen ions are transported. Electrons move from protein to protein in the electron transport chain. Their energy is used to pump the hydrogen ions from outside to inside the thylakoid against a concentration gradient. And the hydrogen ions, they build up inside the thylakoid, and electrons move on to photosystem 1. So these electrons which are being transported in the electron transport chain, they move from protein to protein, okay, and they are transferred and they are used in photosystem 1 again. Okay, and their energy, it is used to pump the hydrogen ions from the outside to the inside of the thylakoid membrane, because they need to cross an concentration gradient. Okay, so the hydrogen ions, they build up inside the thylakoid. Now we have the hydrogen ions inside the thylakoid, and electrons, they move on to the photosystem 1. So these are the steps which take place in photosystem 2. Now let's move on to photosystem 1 and check out what happens in photosystem 1. Okay, so photosystem 1 and energy carrying molecules. In photosystem 1, chlorophyll and other light absorbing molecules in the thylakoid membrane, they also absorb energy from the sunlight. The energy is added to electrons, some of which enter photosystem 1 from photosystem 2. Now what happens next? In step 4, energy is absorbed from the sunlight. As in photosystem 2, chlorophyll and other light absorbing molecules inside the thylakoid membrane, they absorb energy from sunlight. That means even in photosystem 1, the energy is absorbed from the sunlight by the chlorophyll and the energy absorbing molecules. Then electrons are energized and they leave the molecules. Okay, so once the energy is absorbed from the sunlight, the electrons, they are energized and they leave the molecules. Okay, then in step 5, NADPH is produced. This is step 5, as you can see. So the energized electrons are added to a molecule called NADP. This is NADP to which these energized electrons are added, forming a molecule known as NADPH. In photosynthesis, NADP functions like ADP and NADPH, it functions like ATP. That means which has more energy, NADP or NADPH?
NADPH.
Yes, NADPH is ATP, which is produced by adding more energized electrons to NADP. It becomes NADPH. Okay, so the molecule of NADPH is, it will go to the light independent reactions. So these two photosystems, they now took place in the light dependent reactions. That means they took place in the grana of the chloroplast. Okay, we are splitting further the light dependent reactions into photosystem 2 and photosystem 1. Is it clear, girls?
Yes.
Okay, we also have the steps 6 and 7 in which the ATP is produced. We just now checked as to how NADPH is produced in step 5. Now let's check out step 6. Which is the ATP production. The final part of the light dependent reactions, they make ATP. The production of ATP, it depends on the hydrogen ions that build up inside the thylakoid from photosystem 2. So we just now discussed about the hydrogen ions which were transferred to the thylakoid membrane here, right? So what happened to these thylakoid membrane, the hydrogen ions of the thylakoid membrane in photosystem 1? The production of ATP depends on the hydrogen ions that build up inside the thylakoid from photosystem 2 and on a complex enzyme in the thylakoid membrane. So in step 6, hydrogen ion diffusion, it takes place. Hydrogen ions, they flow through a protein channel in the thylakoid membrane. Recall that the concentration of hydrogen ions is higher inside the thylakoid than it is outside. This difference in hydrogen ion concentration is called chemoosmotic gradient, or it is chemiosmotic gradient, which stores potential energy. Therefore, the ions, they flow through the channel by diffusion. What is diffusion?
Like flowing from an area of higher concentration to an area of lower concentration.
Very good. Moving from an area of higher concentration to an area of lower concentration is known as diffusion. Okay, so this is what takes place in step 6, which is known as hydrogen ion diffusion. How does the diffusion take place? Hydrogen ions, they are flowing through a process, through the protein channel which they entered in photosystem 2. Okay, so in that protein channel in thylakoid membrane, also recall that the concentration of hydrogen ions is higher inside the thylakoid than in the outside. So because of this, the difference in the concentration levels, the difference in hydrogen ion concentration, it is known as chemiosmotic gradient. Okay, and it also stores the potential energy, and with the help of this, that is how the diffusion takes place. Because of the difference in concentration, the ions, they flow through the channel by diffusion. That is, they are moving from a higher concentration to the lower concentration. Now what happens in step 7? The ATP is produced. The protein channel in step 6 is part of a complex enzyme called ATP synthase. As the ions flow through the channel, ATP synthase makes ATP by adding phosphate groups to ADP. Okay, so during this process, the ADP, to this ADP, the extra phosphate groups are added and this is converted to ATP. Okay, so ADP, it has changed to ATP when hydrogen ions, they flow through the ATP synthase. When these hydrogen ions, they are flowing through the diffusion through this protein channel. Okay, the protein channel in step 6 is a part of the complex enzyme known as ATP synthase. Okay, so what does it do? As the ions flow through the channel, the ATP synthase, it makes ATP by adding phosphate to the ADP. So this is how the ATP is made in step 7. Okay, so it might be a little complex for you. Photosystem 2 is quite easy for you to remember. Okay, so I'm sure the steps in photosystem 2, they are clear, step 1, 2 and 3. Let me again go through the 4 steps in photosystem 1 so that it's clear for you. Okay, so in photosystem 1, in step 4, what happens? The energy is absorbed from the sunlight. Again, the chlorophyll and the energy absorb molecules, they absorb the energy from the sunlight. Then inside the thylakoid membrane, they absorb energy from sunlight, and electrons are energized and they leave the molecule. Then in step 5, the NADPH is produced. This is also a type of energy. The energized electrons are added to a molecule called NADP, which is forming a molecule called NADPH. After the electrons are added, it forms NADPH. Now this NADPH is it contains energy like ATP. Okay, now it is energized because the electrons have been added, and it functions similarly like ATP. The molecule of NADPH, it goes to the light-dependent reactions from here. So we'll study about it again when we are studying about the light-dependent reactions. Light-independent reactions. Now let's talk about step 5, wherein the ATP production, the entire ATP production takes place. In step 6, the hydrogen ion diffusion takes place. Hydrogen ions, they flow through a protein channel in thylakoid membrane, as we just checked in photosystem 2. And the concentration of hydrogen ions is higher inside the thylakoid than it is outside. Because of the difference in concentration, the hydrogen ions, they are moving by the process of diffusion. Okay, and this difference in concentration, it is known as chemiosmotic gradient, which stores the potential energy. Now, how is the ATP produced? Is the protein channel in step 6. It is part of a complex enzyme known as ATP synthase. What does this ATP synthase do? It makes ATP by adding the phosphate group to the ADP. Is it clear?
Yes.
Any doubts?
It's a little confusing.
Okay, okay. I will ask you to summarize it later again. Let me first talk about the summary. So you can see on this page number 104, in this figure, the scientists, they have made detailed computer models of ATP synthase, which you can see on top, and scientists are still working on viewing the actual molecule which is at the bottom. Okay, this is how the ATP synthase looks like, which helps in the production of ATP. Okay, so how do we summarize the light-dependent reactions now? Energy is captured from sunlight by light-absorbing molecules, and the energy is transferred to electrons that enter an electron transport chain. Then, water molecules are broken down into hydrogen ions, electrons, and oxygen molecules. The water molecules, they provide the hydrogen ions and electrons that are used in the light-dependent reactions. Now, energized electrons, they have two functions. They provide energy for the hydrogen transport, and they are added to an ATP to form NADPH. The flow of hydrogen ions through ATP synthase, it makes ATP. Then the products are oxygen, NADPH, and ATP. Okay, so these are the products of the light-dependent reactions. Oxygen is given off as a waste product, and energy from ATP and NADPH is used later to make sugars in the light-independent reactions. Okay, so these are the steps which take place in photosystem 2 and photosystem 1. Okay. Let me again go through it for you so that you have a clear picture. So this is where we studied about photosystem 2, where in step 1, 2 and 3 took place. Okay, and finally in photosystem 1, the NADPH and ATP is produced, and also oxygen has been produced, which is released as a waste product. And these NADPH and ATP which are produced, they are used in the light independent reactions in the production of, used in the making of ATP. Okay. So here we are going to again talk about the light independent reactions. Girls, you have any questions so far?
No,
Is it clear?
Yes.
No doubts?
No.
Okay. Let me ask you a quick question from here. Describe how energy from sunlight is transferred to ATP and NADPH.
The energy from sunlight is captured by the chlorophyll, and then the chlorophyll releases the energy through electrons, and that energy from electrons is added to the NADP, turning it into NADPH, and the same thing with what's called ADP, turning it into ATP.
And what helps in the formation of ATP?
The enzyme called ATP synthase.
Right. Very good. Thank you so much, Lee. If I'm trying to summarize the entire process of the light-independent reactions, then the electrons, they absorb energy from sunlight, and some of the energy is used to pump hydrogen ions against a concentration gradient. Then the hydrogen ions then flow back through a protein channel to enable ATP synthase to add a phosphate group to ADP to produce ATP. And energized electrons also provide energy to add hydrogen ions to NADP to produce NADPH. Okay, so this is how NADPH and ATP are produced. Do you want me to move on to the next stage or the second stage of photosynthesis? Okay, we have information about the scientist Jan Baptista van Helmont. He was the first to try to scientifically address the question of where plants got their food. Okay, his experiment, which was conducted in the 1600s, it tested the idea that all of the plant's nutrients came from soil. Then he planted a willow tree seedling in a pot of soil. And after weighing both the tree and the soil, he planted a willow tree seedling in a pot of soil, and after weighing both the tree and the soil, after 5 years, the tree had gained about 74 kilograms, but the soil has lost only 57 grams or 2 ounces. He wrongly concluded that the nutrients were coming from the waste from the water he provided. Okay, so first he thought that the trees, they get their nutrients from the soil. Okay, then what did he do? He wrongly concluded that the nutrients were coming from the water he provided. Then in late 1700s, Joseph Priestley was able to demonstrate that a plant produces oxygen or restores air. Several years later, Jan Ingenhousz showed that air was restored only when the green parts of the plant were exposed to sunlight. At that point, the assumption was that plants were able to absorb carbon dioxide from the air and then split it to produce carbon, which was then joined to water to form carbohydrates. It was not until the late 1930s that a complete understanding of photosynthesis was achieved. C.B. Van Meel realized that it was not carbon dioxide being split, but water in the presence of sunlight. Hydrogen split from water was added to carbon dioxide to produce sugars with oxygen as a byproduct. So it took so many years for the scientists to finally come to a conclusion as to how the process of photosynthesis took place in the plants and how the carbon dioxide was absorbed, utilized in the making of the food for the plants, and also the oxygen was released as the byproduct. Okay? So I'll just give you an overview of the second stage of photosynthesis. The second stage is obviously the light-independent reactions, which we already studied about briefly in your lesson 4.2. So the second stage of photosynthesis, it uses energy from the first stage to make sugars. So the NADPH and the ATP, which were released in the first set of reactions, which is the light-dependent reactions, they are used up in the second stage, which is the light-independent reactions. The light-independent reactions, like the light-dependent reactions, they take place inside the chloroplast, but they take place in the... Where do they take place?
Stroma.
in the stroma of the chloroplast. But as the name implies, the light-independent reactions, they do not need sunlight. They don't need any sunlight. And these reactions, they can take place any time that energy is available. Okay, for the light-dependent reactions, the sunlight is important. So they take place only when sunlight is available. Whereas the light-independent reactions, they can take place any time, even when sunlight is absent, only in the presence of energy. These reactions can take place any time that energy is available. The energy sources for the light-independent reactions are the molecules of ATP and NADPH formed during the light-dependent reactions. The energy is needed for the series of chemical reactions called the Calvin's cycle, which is named for the scientist who discovered this process. Okay, so these light-independent reactions, we can name them as a Calvin's cycle, named after the scientist. The light-dependent reactions, we can name them as photosystem 2 and photosystem 1, whereas only the light-independent reactions, they are named as the Calvin's cycle. Okay. So in the Calvin cycle cannot take place without the ATP and NADPH from the light-dependent reactions. And the chemical reactions of the Calvin cycle, they use carbon dioxide gas from the atmosphere and the energy carried by the ATP and NADPH to make simple sugars. Okay, so in this second part, the sunlight is not at all required, but ATP and NADPH are very important. These reactions, they cannot take place without ATP and NADPH. And of course, they also make use of the carbon dioxide from the environment, and they make their sugars, which is glucose. So because the light-independent reactions build sugar molecules, they are the synthesis part of photosynthesis. Okay, so if you're trying to split the entire process of photosynthesis, the photo takes place in the light-dependent reactions, and the synthesis of glucose, it takes place in the light-independent reactions. Okay, so only one molecule of carbon dioxide is actually added to the Calvin cycle at a time. Okay, and the simplified cycle, it shows 3 carbon dioxide molecules added at once. You can see the Calvin cycles picture clearly on your page number 105. This is how it looks like. Okay. So according to the presentation here, the light-independent reactions, they occur in the stroma, and they use carbon dioxide molecules from the atmosphere. The second stage of photosynthesis is the light-independent reactions. This stage also happens in the chloroplast, but in stroma and not in the thylakoids or grana. This stage is light-independent because it does not need light. These reactions use energy from ATP and NADPH to run the chemical reactions that make up the Calvin cycle. The chemical reactions of the Calvin cycle, they use carbon dioxide and energy from ATP and NADPH to make sugars. So these are the various steps which take place in the Calvin's cycle. A molecule of glucose is formed as it stores some of the energy captured from the sunlight. So we'll discuss the various steps involved in the Calvin cycle, inshallah, in our next lesson. Okay, girls. So far, if you have any doubts, you may ask me. Is it clear?
Yes.
Okay. So in the next lesson, inshallah, we shall complete the Calvin cycle and also solve the worksheets for this topic. And I shall download a video about this Calvin cycle so that I can play in the next class. So it makes it clear for you. Okay. So though I'm not asking you to explain the video or summarize the video or recap the session, shall I send you the videos on YouTube? Will you be able to watch it on the group related to the topic?
Yes.